But as far as sound goes, look, I like a big fat sound that's not too heavily overdriven. Even though I play in a band that plays covers, and a lot of the times I've got to select a tone which will suit the song by the original artist who might have used a very fuzzy sound. So I'm kind of steered that way for those type of songs. But when I'm making my own sound, I like a not too heavily overdriven sound, and the best way to get that is to use uh, an amp that hasn't got a very hard clipping overdrive channel. And what I mean by hard clipping relates back to the waveform that one sees on an oscilloscope when they're feeding that signal into an oscilloscope. A clean signal is like a nice wave, nice clean wave, whereas a heavily clipped wave is a very square wave. Uh, and the sort of the heavy metal wave is a very angular sort of pointy wave. Uh, Obviously no one can check the waveform of your amplifier necessarily when you're just trying it out in the shop, but this soft clipping to me is the greatest sound, and soft clipping is achieved by using things like tube screamers and overdrive pedals rather than heavy metal pedals. There is no scientific evidence to support the fact that tube amps are less reliable than solid state amps. They are essentially the same circuit when it all boils down to it. It's just, tubes and transistors are interchangeable in an electronic circuit. Uh, there's certain characteristics of tubes which guitarists find desirable. They're not necessarily what an electronics engineer would find desirable. An output tube distorts in such a way that they have been superseded by transistors which don't distort. But guitarists being the crazy folk we are, we like that distortion. It's a pleasing sound. There's a whole range of research done as to why that is pleasing, but and who knows? I guess it's just fashionable. If all of a sudden all the greatest players in the world switched to solid state and it was all very clean and distortion was passé, well, I guess we might be seeking out solid state amps, and they would generally do the job just as well if that was the particular sound that was popular. But you'd have to start playing differently, because with a tube amp, the amp, as the guitar is, it's becomes part of you. This is art we're talking about. We're not talking about electronic engineering here. This is an art form. Where the guitar and the amp become part of the player to create the sound that you're hearing. Now, to the audience out there, they're not going to really know any of that. But for the person playing, it's this experience of hearing that particular sound when you do something very subtle with your fingers on the guitar. Look, a lot of mistakes that guitarists make these days, is when a band is playing on stage and it's all mic'd up and it's being mixed from up the back of the hall, they play too loud. Okay, they use big amps, which are cool, but they play too loud and they get cut out of the mix as a result. This is what I found when I was judging the band comp, is that a lot of guitarists, they bring their quad boxes and their 100-watt Marshalls, which look fabulous on stage, but they're mic'd up. So there's one microphone stuck in front of one speaker, which tells me that they could have come along with an amp with one speaker in it. Because, it's really important that they're in the mix, coming out of the front of house speakers, and not just the whole band coming out of the front of house speakers and the guitarist just coming out of his quad box, which is a very narrow sound. Doesn't spread through the room. As you walk past, you can't hear it, then you can really hear it like deafeningly loud, and then you can't hear it. So, the stacks look fabulous, but they could, if they're doing these gigs, they can just use a small amp, which is mic'd up. But they need a big enough amp so they can hear themselves over the drums on the stage. They need to be able to hear themselves, obviously, if they're not... a lot of young bands these days, there might be half a dozen bands playing on a particular night. They're sort of on the stage, they're off the stage, but there's usually a sound guy doing the sound for them. So turn down. Get your sound. If you can't get the overdriven tube sound with your 100-watt amp, which you really can't do in most venues, you need to use a smaller amp. I use a 30-watt amp on stage, and I've played really big gigs and I've played really small gigs with it.